Hello, I'm Helen Edwards from the Foundation Stage Forum. I'm joined by my colleague Jules Mickleborough, and we have three very important guests with us today. We have Gill Jones, Ofsted's Early Education Deputy Director, Wendy Ratcliff, HMI, and Dr. Julian Grenier, Head Teacher of Sheringham Nursery School and Children's Centre. Julian, as we all know, has been leading on the new non-statutory guidance, Development Matters, for the Department for Education. Today we're going to be listening to their presentations, and then we have quite a number of questions which have been posed by our Facebook group, which comprises 17,000 members. Now, they'll be relieved to hear that we haven't got 17,000 questions. We did have 50 or 60, and we've grouped them because many of them, as you'd expect, were quite similar. So we'll come to the questions a bit later, but we're going to hear from Julian first for a short 10-15 minute presentation. Over to you, Julian.
Great, lovely. Thank you, Helen. And it's great to be at this event that Foundation Stage Forum is hosting. And I guess just before we kind of kick into the presentation, it's just to say that a massive tribute really to everyone in the early years who's working so hard at the moment for children and families. And, you know, we're probably experiencing many of the same stresses and struggles as everyone else out there here at Sheringham Nursery School, trying to make sure our earliest provision is safe and wonderful for the children and families, with so much else that's going on. And we must begin with that daily reality and importance of what everyone out there is doing. And I take my hat off to all of the whole of the early years sector for everything that's happening. So I'm going to talk us a little through a few of the kind of headlines of the updated Development Matters. So if we start the PowerPoint, I think the first important thing to say about Development Matters is that this doesn't replace the current version of Development Matters until September 2021. And this is really a period now for the sector to become familiar with the new document. But I wouldn't suggest that anyone makes any significant changes to what they are doing at the moment. We've all got plenty on our minds without doing that. So let's take this in a measured way over the next 11 months, become familiar with the guidance and think through what it means for us. Now, if you're an early adopter school, then you are in a slightly different position. And it's great to see that Foundation Stage Forum is going to be offering some specific support for the early adopters. But for the rest of the sector, I would say use the time to think and consider and make sense of the new guidance, and don't start making any big changes quickly. So if we kind of start by thinking about the big picture of early years here, which is my second slide. So if we begin by thinking about the big picture is what sort of experiences do we want our children to have in the early years? What is it that we want them to be able to do? What do we want them to learn? That's really what this is all about. Development Matters is not that curriculum. So the responsibility for that curriculum sits exactly where it ought to, which is with the settings, the childminders, the early years teachers in schools and their practitioners. They're the right people to make the decisions about the curriculum that's right for their children, that's right for the local community, and is also ambitious. Development Matters sits in the background as guidance to help people think about some of the typical sequences of children's learning and development. And it also gives some suggestions of the ways that adults can help. But I think where we go wrong with this is if we think Development Matters is the curriculum and we've got to cover all of these things, and we then start putting this huge focus on coverage, which I'll talk about a bit in a moment. But there's one other important thing which I think is relevant at the moment, which is the curriculum has to be flexible. So I'm looking at the kids coming into Sheringham Nursery School for the first time, our new starters, and I'm also spending time and talking about our returners. And we've got to make sure that we adapt what we're doing to meet the needs of those children now. So in other words, the curriculum we offer isn't some static and fixed thing. It has to be adapted and it has to be right for the children at different times. So I'm expecting we're going to be putting a lot more focus, certainly in the months ahead, on children's physical development, and also supporting their PSED and supporting their communication and language, because that's what the children need who've been in difficult circumstances, locked down for a period of time. So earlier I talked a bit about the question of development matters not being the curriculum and coverage and progress. So the danger we have is that if we're very focused on children moving from one band to the next, we get very fixed on covering lots and lots of new things, but that is not the way that the best practice in early years works. The best practice in early years is about checking that children are secure, that they've had plenty of time to learn and experience things in different contexts, that they're confident, that they've practiced things over and over again, and it's only then that we start to think about where the next step for their progress should be. So this is not all about moving children from one band to the next. It's about thinking about the big picture of what we want children to learn in our settings, and then thinking really carefully about how do we check that they're secure? Have they had enough time to really practice and repeat things? Have they done things in different contexts? So I think just to give a kind of maybe rather basic example, you know, when I think of the small toddlers who would in normal times be in our children's centre stay and play, you know, many of them have never used a wheeled toy before. So there's a lot of getting on and off those wooden push along four-wheel toys that we've got, which are so lovely for them. And we're not kind of thinking, gosh, this child needs to kind of move on to a tricycle. We know they need a lot of time to explore and to get confident and to repeat stuff. And as they move into our 2-year-old provision, then they often do encounter a tricycle for the first time. And again, there's a lot of new stuff to learn there. So balancing on the seat, steering, pedaling. Then when you can do those things individually, you have to work out how you combine them all together. So like lots of early years practitioners, you know, my shins are appallingly bruised by the numbers of children that have kind of belted into me on wheeled toys. And again, that takes a lot of time. And as children move into our 3 and 4 provision and we're seeing them really confident and fluent using trikes, then we move them onto 2-wheel bikes. So we've got that progression model, but we're always checking that children have had plenty of time with the phase they're in at the moment before we think about the next step. And we've got a big picture in our setting around wheeled toys, if you like, that moves from those 4-wheel push-alongs to the 3-wheel trike, to the 2-wheel balance bike, to the pedal bike without stabilizers. And we're ambitious. We want all our children to be on a 2-wheel bike by the time they end nursery. But we know that we've got to take it at the pace of the children, and we've got to make sure they're secure where they are before we start introducing something new to them. You don't want to be given a 2-wheel bike if you're not yet riding a trike confidently. But the other thing I'd say about curriculum is that it's important to have that big picture, but it's also important in the early years to think about being flexible and also being sensible around it. So we know that children come in with sudden new interests and excitements, and it's important to capitalize on that. You know, motivation, children pursuing their fascinations are a very, very significant part of early years. So we're constantly having to keep that careful balance between, on the one hand, there are things we really want children to experience and to know, but on the other hand, the children's own motivation and fascinations are important. And that's why early years is such a great phase to be working in, because it's about that balancing act. The final bit I'd like to focus on here, to move the slide on, is around trust and professionalism. So there is a lot less content in the new development matters than there was in the previous version. It's about 2/3 of the length. And that is an opportunity for our sector, which is to say that we don't need the level of guidance and prescription that perhaps has traditionally been in the system. We can trust our early years practitioners, our teachers, to make the right decisions for the children they're working with without having to follow an enormous amount of guidance that's broken down into small steps. And one of the key issues here really is about professional development for our staff teams. What's really going to change things for children isn't document A or document B. It's the professional development of our teams, and then the way that our teams work together and meet the needs and also engage with the strengths and the fascinations of the children that we're working with. So I'm not making any apology for the fact that we, in this document, we're reducing the amount of content and prescription, and we're putting more trust in the early years teams around the country and the childminders around the country. But the implication of that is that we need to put a great focus on staff professional development. And in time, I think there are also some tricky questions we need to address around the quality of initial qualifications across the sector. So the next message I'd really like to focus on is about the question of progression. So, of course, it really matters that we help children to make progress, but the model for that progress is the curriculum we've designed for the children we're working with. Go back to that example about the trikes and the bikes, for example. So if we know that children are doing well using that model with the resources we're offering them and all of that adult interaction and support, we don't need a huge amount of data or tracking or assessment. Those children are doing well. We can celebrate how well they're doing. We can celebrate that with their parents. And that then frees up a lot of time for us to think about the children that are struggling, the children that we need to spend more significant amounts of time observing, getting to know, trying to understand the child's strengths, but also the barriers to their learning, forging that partnership with the parents, maybe making links to outside agencies. So one of the key points in the guidance is, before you start doing lots of work around assessment, think about why you're doing it, what the purpose is, and how useful it's going to be. I think that for a lot of children, the real purpose of what we should be doing and what we can use Tapestry for example, is to find those examples where children are learning something that is really significant for them, that's sustained over time, and shows how the child is really becoming a more powerful learner. So those lovely vignettes, those lovely little examples that you can share with parents about how a child returned to something over a period of a few days and really persevered and really got somewhere with their learning, thinking about children becoming more powerful learners, using communication more as they learn, talking and thinking, looking back over what they've learned previously as they become stronger learners. So those are the sorts of things that I think are really valuable to use Tapestry for. And we know that having those things to both reflect on with parents, but also for children to look back on, is really helpful to build the partnership with parents, but also to help children reflect on their own progress and development as learners. So one of the sound bites, I guess, that I'm trying to share with a lot of people here as we look at the new developments is checkpoints, not checklists, which is the next slide. So, do we need lots of checklists for all of the children we're working with to make sure that they're doing well? No. What we need is the right curriculum and the highly skilled staff working with the children. And the progress model is through the curriculum and through the way that the staff work with those children. So there are checkpoints in the new development matters, and they're in place in the prime areas really to help staff who may be less experienced, or maybe in a school, for example, someone who's new to EYFS, just to see some of the key things that we might expect children to be doing at certain stages in their development. So they're there to guide. They're not there to be turned into a checklist and used for all children. And staff who are more experienced in the early years are going to need them much less than newer or less experienced staff. What we also certainly need to have in the early years are systems to make sure that no groups of children are missing out. So if you've got large numbers of disadvantaged children on roll funded by the offer for 2-year-olds or eligible for early years pupil premium, then of course it's really vital that you've got systems in place to make sure that those children are getting the sort of provision they need and are making strong progress like everyone else is. If you're in a setting where you're counting those children on the fingers of one hand, that sort of system isn't going to be sensible. It's really just going to be looking at each child as an individual and thinking through the sort of support that's being offered to them. But the main point I would put to everyone here is what we haven't yet done well in the system in England is to make sure that all children are doing really well in their early years, and the gaps between disadvantaged children and everyone else are still a matter of concern. And that's something that we do definitely need to keep an eye on. But the alternative to this approach is that we end up with enormous amounts of data on children, which aren't really useful for us as practitioners. They don't really mean anything to parents when you share them with parents. They tie up an enormous amount of our time, which we could spend doing other things which are more valuable. So it's an awful lot of work for not a lot of outcomes for the children. And that, I think, is where we are hoping that the new development matters will give managers and teams and childminders and school leaders the opportunity over the year ahead just to rethink the balance of what we're doing and make sure that we're putting our efforts where they really need to be. And that really takes me on to my final slide here. And that is about moral purpose. So I'm always meeting people working in the early years, and they're here because they really passionately want to make a difference for children. I don't know anyone who said, I trained to be an early years educator because I like to generate a lot of data on a spreadsheet and analyze it. But I do meet people who are incredibly passionate about their work. And I think we've got an opportunity now to put a lot more trust in our workforce and to say to the sector, let's put our efforts where they're going to make a difference, which is in the direct work with the children. It's the playing, it's the conversations, it's helping children to learn to do something new. It's the respectful partnership with the parents. That's where the difference happens. And we've got to make space and time to put our efforts there. And we've got to stop doing things which are both very time consuming, but also very unlikely to result in anything positively happening for a child. Why are we in the job? You know, we're here because we want to do the very, very best for children. We want to inspire children. We want to give them the skills in their physical development and communication. We want to give them the confidence and the self-belief that they're going to do really, really well as learners through the school system. That's why we're all here. So we've got to take the emphasis away from where it isn't productive and really focus on what will make a difference for children.
Thank you so much, Julian. What really resonated with me towards the end of your talk there was around how staff are going to need to be a little bit braver now. So not relying on a recipe of tick lists and you tick one and then look at the next thing, but just to expand and be a little bit braver, find out about narrative observations in the way that you were describing, and not to rely on tick lists because they have this misunderstanding, in my view, that they're required, and that, you know, data and percentages and this child was here then and here now, and so my job is done. We've got to get away from that mindset, and I think there is going to be a tremendous amount of bravery required from practitioners who have been used to doing this for a number of years. But of course, before these tick lists arrived, we all worked in early years and primary education without them. When I started working in early years, this didn't exist, and I think we did quite a good job. So it's a shame that this over-reliance on ticky-listy things has happened, but I agree with you. We really need to try and quash this, and we've got a year to do it, I think.
Yeah, so there's plenty of time to become familiar with this new way of working and to discuss it, to interpret it in a way that is going to make sense for your setting or for you as a childminder. And just to reiterate that message from earlier, this is not the moment to start doing a whole load of new things. I would suggest that everyone just stays steady with their systems that are working now, but allows themselves a bit of thinking and reflection time. So we as a teaching school, we ran a big project called Celebrating Children's Learning with a group of schools, early years settings and childminders. And one of the biggest things we learned from Celebrating Children's Learning was that an awful lot of time was spent by people just making notes of what children could do. And often different people would note the same thing about the same child over and over again. And they did it because there was an expectation about how much they should be recording, or because people wanted the data. But what the team that worked on Celebrating Children's Learning noticed was that what was really useful was to be very present with the child whilst they're doing something new or difficult or exciting, and help them, or just be there as an encouraging figure who's taking an interest in watching, or think about what you've noticed and what new equipment or new learning environment you might prepare for the next day. Those are the things that make a difference to the children. So not feeling you've got to jot things down or note things down on an iPad all the time, which of course takes you away from the child and takes you away from the moment. And the thing that helped practitioners celebrate children and the way they learned with parents were those little stories, if you like, about a child's significant learning and progress, and that really explained to parents, Jamal, when he first started, would do things for a few minutes here or there and then go and do something with someone else. But here we're seeing him stick at this for half an hour, and it was really difficult for him. And then he came back to it the next day. That brings learning and progress alive for parents and creates a really strong partnership. And it's great then to hear from exactly the same sort of stories from parents about what their children do at home. And I think that's the real value of Tapestry. And the second thing we learned from that is that we must involve children in all of those discussions, because actually children become more powerful learners if we make explicit what they're doing and how it's working. So there's real use to a small amount of in-depth narrative observation of that kind. I would say there's little or no value in just endlessly taking photos and labeling them. Jamal likes playing in the water. Jamal, is developing friendships with a small group of children. I've never met a key person who doesn't know that their key child is spending time playing with the water and is starting to make friends with other children. There's no value in writing it down at all.
Totally agree. Thank you for that, Julian. Shall we hand over to Gill and Wendy? I think Jules is going to lines up for this presentation.
Lovely. Thank you. And I just want to support there what Julian was saying about what is important to capture. And Julian, you gave a lovely example there of supporting the child and being present with the child in whatever they're doing. And I think a key element of that, and this is where CPD for practitioners comes in, is being able to know when you intervene, demonstrate, and or teach, if you want another phrase for that, demonstrate how to do something so that the child can then copy, and you structure then your support for that child, so that you give them enough opportunity to practice and practice and practice until they become expert, and you set them free. And a sensitive practitioner will do that in so many ways. And that's the real key to progress. And of course, what a practitioner has to do is identify when a child isn't doing something that they need to learn to do, because that is why we need a curriculum, because a curriculum helps us set out the framework of what children need to learn to do in their foundation years. So really, like your messages.
I think a really useful piece of research, which I'll dig out the proper reference for, which we can maybe share on the forum because I can't cite it off the top of my head, is 10 Myths of Early Maths, because that explains the high wire act we are doing every day as early years practitioners really well, which is, first of all, it makes very clear that toddlers in their freely chosen play will be learning about mathematical concepts constantly. So that play for those toddlers is incredibly rich for their mathematical learning. And that's why high quality play-based provision is so integral to the early years foundation stage statutory framework and development matters. But 10 Myths of Early Maths also tells us that it is not possible for children to learn everything they need to know about number and shape and measure through their own self-directed play. They also need adults to guide some of their learning, to introduce them to things like the count sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, to make sure that they properly understand that it's not just a sequence that they're saying, but that each thing they say in the sequence relates to an actual thing, and that when they say 5, that tells them the full number of the set, because we all know the children at that earlier stage of development who've got the count sequence right, but don't realize it has one-to-one matching, or just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, because they're not clear that the last thing they point to and the number that they say is the full number of their set. And balancing that adult guided learning with children's play and exploration, that's critical to high quality early years practice. And I think it's also widely understood, and it's evidenced in the EPSI report, that as children get older in the EYFS, they need more of that sort of adult guided learning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I've got a lovely video of some children in a construction area with a tape. It was a nursery school in Wigan that I was visiting, and the child is counting very nicely up to about 7 or 8, and then he says 99, 100 with great pride, and it just shows the joy that and children want to learn, don't they? So, but it is that sensitive intervention and knowing that there are some things that you just have to show children how to do, demonstrate, so that they develop, they learn more in that way. Well, thank you, Helen and Jules, for inviting us to be part of this podcast. Myself, Gill Jones and Wendy are really keen to support the sector, and we echo everything that Julian said about the difficult times that many of you, well, all of you will be facing in one way or another at this time of the pandemic. So as Julian said, we agree with, let's take this one step at a time. There's no need to rush into things, but there is a need, I think, and has been a need for quite some time to consider why we're doing things in certain ways, what we need to keep hold of, and what actually is getting in the way of us being able to spend quality time in supporting children's development. Okay, so our session's about myth busting on what Ofsted actually are looking at on inspection. Okay, so we thought firstly it would be helpful to give you a picture about what we're doing this term, because as you'll be aware, the Secretary of State suspended the routine inspections across all our remits. So whether you're working in a school or an early years setting, we're not coming out at the moment and doing the education inspection framework inspections. So if you're in a school, that means we're not doing Section 5 inspections, we're not doing Section 8 inspections. And if you're in an early years setting that is registered with Ofsted, that means that we're not doing the EIF inspections that you would have in your inspection cycle. So that remains suspended, and at the moment we don't know how long that suspension lasts, and of course that will be related to what happens with the pandemic. But what we are doing at this point in time is we're visiting schools. So I'll talk about schools, and then Wendy, you can talk about the early years settings. So what we're doing is we're visiting schools and we're doing some research about how schools are coping with the pandemic. What arrangements they're making for their children, how they are ensuring that children get back into the full curriculum and get back to learning. And Julian, you made some really good points about you having to be flexible in Sheringham. And sort of looking at what children's new starting points are, whether that be for your children who've already started in nursery and are coming back for their second year, or for your totally new starters. So I actually think that's one of the things that early years practitioners are really good at. They're really good at considering children's starting points. So this is what we're looking at, the flexibility of schools in assessing what children have remembered from what they've been taught before, and what they need to repeat and go over and practice, and where they need to be introduced to new things. So that's essentially what our visits are about in the school space. And those visits will culminate in an aggregated report to government about the national picture across, I think we're visiting about 1,200 schools as part of this project. So Wendy, would you like to talk about the early years settings that are registered with Ofsted?
Absolutely, thank you, Jill. So for registered early years, we of course at Ofsted, we're the regulator as well as the inspector. So for registered early years, we're doing two things in the autumn term. One of the things that we're doing for our registered early years settings is that we're doing an interim visit within our regulatory space to those providers who were judged as to require improvement or inadequate at their last inspection. And if those providers have got safeguarding and welfare actions set at those inspections, then that's what we're going to do a visit for, to follow up on those actions, to see what progress settings have made. And then we report what we find on those visits through an outcome summary, which we'll publish on our website. The second thing that we're doing in the registered early years space is we're also doing some survey work, but we're keeping that separate from those regulatory visits. So in early years, we're going to be making a number of telephone calls to around 800 providers, just to find out some of those things that Jill was talking about in the schools for schools. So how is the sector recovering from the pandemic and dealing with the pandemic? What impact has it had for early years providers? What impact is it having for children? And thinking about the curriculum for those children when they return to their early years provider, recognising that we know that, for some children, not all, but for some children, they've been away from their childminder or their nursery for 6 months now. So again, that information will feed into the aggregated report that Gill was referring to.
Okay, so quite a different role for Ofsted, and we've started the pilots just this week. All our inspectors are going out and, in the school space and testing out the methodology that we've developed to gather that information, and it's really interesting what's coming back, and it just goes to demonstrate the effort and the professionalism that schools and practitioners are showing during this quite difficult time. So shall we move on to the next slide, please?
Next slide.
Okay, so we thought it would be helpful to just give you a bit of a reminder about why we developed the education inspection framework and how that relates to the what Julian has been talking about in terms of the new development matters. And one of the reasons that we developed the EIF was because the accountability system that exists in the gathering of data and the weighing of the pig, to put it bluntly, can actually divert providers away from thinking about what it is that children need to learn and be taught, the substance of education. And so what we did in the EIF is to refocus that substance in and put it the heart of the EIF, looking at the curriculum, because the curriculum is the framework upon which children's progress and development is developed. And so we were keen to get away from schools telling us about the number of children that had made 3 months progress, and that progress measure to be measured all the time, and a lot of data being given to inspectors. We were also keen to ensure that children had a broad base of knowledge that supported them to do well in their GCSEs, for example, when they were older, and not just a base of knowledge that was about passing the GCSE exam. So this related to the whole system. And I think in early years, we were very, very keen that we cut back on the workload, the data gathering, the endless bits of information of Jamal playing in the water that Julian gave the information for. So that's why we developed the EIF. And this was Amanda, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, Amanda Spielman. This is what she said when we presented the EIF to the education sector. And I won't read it all out, but the focus on substance, on the knowledge that we want children and young people to acquire, is often lost. And we were seeing that over and over again through our inspections of schools, where many of our conversations were about data rather than what it is children are learning and why you've made the choices that you've made about what you're teaching. So, she says there, if their entire school experience, and that's, when they start school either in nursery or reception, has been designed to push them through a mark scheme, through hoops, rather than developing a deep body of knowledge, then they will struggle in later study. And we have, a lot of evidence that show us that that's the case. So, it's really important that we reconsider this evidence gathering in early years, because that relates to that whole picture.
Thanks, Jill. And I think this next slide then kind of just really kind of focuses on that whole point of, hitting the target but missing the point, in terms of, are we, taking children through so that they can pass a test, whether that be, at the end of Key Stage 2 or whether that's their GCSE. And I think in early years, it's important that we then don't confuse the early learning goals with the curriculum. And if we only teach children the things that are covered in the early learning goals, we'll be narrowing that curriculum too much, meaning that children will not have that knowledge that they need in order to be prepared for what comes next, and for them to succeed in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And really important to remember that the early learning goals are just the end point of 5 years of learning to assess what children know and remember and can do. That's the point of the early learning goal. And starting with the early learning goals and breaking it down and saying, at the start of reception, where children are in terms of the early learning goals, is rather like saying, okay, well, let's assess children against the GCSE criteria at the start of their GCSE course. I mean, why? No one would think that's sensible. So why we think it's sensible to do that in early years, I've no idea.
Okay, so one of the things in terms of EIF is really focusing in on, thinking about the curriculum and the importance of the curriculum, and asking that question about what is it that children need, that body of knowledge that children need. And one of the things that we did find as part of some of the work that we were doing on the journey to EIF was that there was some confusion about what the term curriculum meant. So if we can go to the next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to make really clear was what our definition at Ofsted, what our definition of the curriculum is. So curriculum very much is at the heart of the framework. And when we think about early years, we're talking about the educational programs. That's the curriculum framework that leaders build on to decide what it is that they want their children in their setting to learn and develop, and why. And then we think about how we're keen to find out how leaders and practitioners decide how they're going to implement that curriculum so that children make that progress across the 7 areas of learning. So thinking about, the teaching, the definition of teaching is still within our inspection handbook, and thinking about that practice and pedagogy. And then thinking about how, as leaders, and this comes to some of that myth busting, how leaders evaluate the impact of that curriculum by checking what children know and can do. And when we're talking about checking what children know and can do, we're not talking about that whole industry that's developed about the data collection.
And much of that knowledge, much of that checking will be inside a practitioner's head. And the key part of that is, thinking towards the end of reception, the key worry will be the children that can't do the things that you would expect them to do, and what you do to ensure that they get the start that they need. And so the identification of what children can't do actually is the thing that will make the difference to helping them to be able to do that in future. It's, so I think a lot of data collection, because we want to be positive, because we want to celebrate what children can do, it's grown by Topsy, and sometimes we actually miss the crucial elements of what children need to learn, particularly if they've had an absence, long term or short term. And that's why identifying starting points and re-identifying starting points after gaps in learning, for whatever reason, is absolutely crucial in terms of developing children's abilities to across the areas for learning. So in Ofsted, when we did our training, for the education inspection framework, we had to extrapolate the difference between curriculum, teaching and assessment goals, because we found in the survey that we wrote, Bold Beginnings, that those things had become very intertwined, and teachers and practitioners themselves were not thinking about the curriculum as the what children need to learn, what they need to be taught and learn, teaching as how that content is taught, the pedagogy, the decisions you make about whether you're teaching individually, in small groups, in the practical situations, what bits have to be taught explicitly, which bits can be learnt in other ways. Those are all teaching decisions about how you decide to adapt what you do in order because of the children that you're with. And then the assessment, which is the checkpoint at which you decide, have children managed to learn what it is that I intended them to learn or not? And of course, if you have no learning intention, as in the curriculum, then it is very difficult to assess what it is that they've done. So the learning and intention and the assessment are intertwined, and the curriculum and the teaching is the pedagogy.
I think, Jill, this slide's really important, and we've in terms of thinking about our myth busting and thinking about that assessment, and actually thinking about what the actual early years foundation stage actually says about assessment. And there's some really important words there, I think, in bold. Should not require excessive paperwork, and that paperwork should be limited to that which is absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
So actually not spending all that time generating, making notes and generating assessment and lots of documents around, assessment for children, but actually spending that time that's also important, because we know, don't we, that early years practitioners can make all the difference to a young child's early education.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important at this stage to say, and I don't know what our next slide is, but when inspectors go on inspection, they won't be asking to look at paperwork. They won't be looking at any paperwork. What they'll be doing is having a conversation with the practitioners or the teacher, whoever it happens to be, about what it is they want children to learn about the curriculum, and why they're making those choices, and how well children are doing in terms of making progress through the curriculum. So if we go back to Julian's example of bikes, and there are children cycling around in the outdoor area on two-wheeled bikes without stabilizers, a conversation that might well be had with the practitioner is, how did you get these children to this stage? What was the progression model that you had in your setting that moved children from not being able to manipulate two four-wheeled wheelie toys to getting onto a bicycle? So that's the curricular conversation we'd be having. And the same, let's take art as an example. The same would happen if we see children being able to mix paints and make the colour green successfully. We'd want to know about what had been taught, what the progression model was for that child to get from probably making sludgy grey out of many, many colours to actually being able to make the colour green. So that's what we mean by the curriculum. And that's the conversation that's important, because no bit of data about 3 months and 6 months is going to show us those things.
And I think that links us in nicely to this slide with that myth busting continuing, and going back to the fact that actually it's those conversations that are important. And Julian, you made a point about, those early years providers that you come across, practitioners, and likewise, didn't go into the early years sector just to be filling in blocks on a spreadsheet. Some of the work that we've joined up with the DFE and the Early Years Alliance on in terms of the workload issues in the sector, and also continuing with some of this myth busting, is that whilst providers are telling us that they recognise these messages that we're saying, but actually they think they will continue to do these this tracking just in case an inspector wants to see it. Yes. But actually our inspectors won't want to see it.
And it's important to say that actually, we've all played a part in developing these sort of spreadsheets. At one point, the head teachers wanted to collect this sort of information because it was seen as outcome information that was useful. And I think that's because on a national scale, sometimes things are useful that are just data to say, because it might show us that, 12,000 children managed to get a good level of development, and so that tells us that they're pretty secure in that area. Nationally, for all the children in England, that may well be a good and useful bit of data. But actually, when you break that down to progress in months, etc., for individual children, it doesn't mean very much at all. What means much more is whether they can count to 10 and have one-to-one correspondence for each number up to 10. That's what counts. And that requires a very different sort of knowledge about children and the curriculum than we see in spreadsheets like this. So that's the change that we've got to make, I think, because this is what we want to get right. We want to give every child the best possible opportunity that we can to be a good learner.
Thank you so much, Gill and Wendy. That was very informative. It's very clear to me that the questions we sent you a couple of days ago, which were retrieved from our support group on Facebook, you've already answered. So although the next plan was going to be Jules and myself asking you those questions, it's very clear you've already covered the vast majority. So I think, Jules, between you and I, should we move on to ones that we don't think we've had a chance to touch on? I'm conscious of the time, and our guests have got incredibly busy days. I can only think of 2 or 3 on my sheet that we may not have touched on. With Jules, are you the same?
Yes, I think I'll start with the first 2 that we were going to start with. And then maybe we can move on from those and see, we'll pick out as we go. So we kind of divided the questions up into themes and areas. And the first 2 questions, I think, really go, I suppose, to the essence of the content of the new DMs as we think about them as a guide for practitioners, that idea of a guidance. And the first one was, what research was used to inform the new development matters? And do you feel there is enough emphasis on the importance of play over more formal learning?
So yes, that's a really important set of questions. So there is a considerable amount of research that sits in the background to the updated development matters. So just to give a few examples, there's a lot of research that the Education Endowment Foundation has pulled together on their early years toolkit, and in reports like Working with Parents and Preparing for Literacy. And that was drawn on substantially. Also, the EPSI report, which looks at children over the long term and what sort of aspects of their early learning make a significant impact on their life chances through our school system. And the successor SEED project as well gives us a lot of information. The field study on professional development and also the play study. So field study led by Professor Iram Siraj and others, the play study led by Sue Rogers and others. Those are some of the important bits of evidence that were drawn on. But I think so that this is kind of a fairly transparent conversation, there's actually an awful lot that is not evidenced or researched around early years. And I think we can be fine about that. So, for example, a lot of what's in Development Matters is based on practice and experience, and the work, for example, here at Sheringham that we've done with our Early Years Hub in Newham and our work as a research school. There isn't necessarily research evidence for all of these things, but there's a lot of practice, wisdom and experience that Development Matters builds on. And it's a mistake for anyone to look for an entirely evidence-based document, because there is no way that anyone has the knowledge base to do that. And I think that practitioner experience and knowing what works well for children is something we shouldn't give up on lightly. I think there's a lot of value in our early years sector in that accumulated understanding and experience. And then I think that gives us our own projects to evaluate and do on our own small scale as settings. So we might want to look at something like when's the best time to start introducing handwriting in reception, and look at kind of different models of that. Does it work better if you introduce it much later in the reception year, so that you're really certain that the large majority of the children have already got all of the physical skills and also the comprehension in place that they need? That there's a lot of kind of school and setting level evaluation and research that it's really important for us to do. Is there enough emphasis on the importance of play? Absolutely, there is. And we know that play is central to early learning. We particularly know that a lot of those thinking skills, if you like, a lot of the ways children develop their self-regulation, become aware of other people, develop their communication. We know that play is the best way for lots of those important areas of learning to happen. And play is really, really central to this. But the caution there is that children can't learn all of the things they need to learn through their self-chosen play in the early years. There is a role for adult-guided learning, and it's then down to the skills of the individual practitioners and the settings, the childminders, to know when the right moment is for individual children.
Thank you, Julian. And the second question in that section was, do you think the new Development Matters adequately addresses anti-racism?
Yeah, and I think, again, let's really be honest in our answer here. Of course it doesn't. How can a brief guidance to early years learning and development adequately address anti-racism? It can't. So let's be straightforward about that. So, but I would add a few comments to that, if you like. First of all, the real work around developing an anti-racist curriculum goes on at the level of the setting and the childminder in the school. That's where the real action happens. The second thing I'd say is that, for me, fundamental to anti-racism is the life chances of children and young people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And when I first started teaching in East London, the children from Bangladeshi heritage families had the lowest educational outcomes of any group of children and young people in the country. And I've been really privileged to stay around East London long enough to see that now children of Bangladeshi heritage are actually doing really well, better than the average child, in fact, in England. And that's central to anti-racism, is improving the life chances of young children. We know that quality early years education and care matters for every single child, but it matters more for children who may be disadvantaged for different reasons. So I would say that a central part of the important focus on anti-racism is listening to and acting on the experiences of Black and minority ethnic people in our communities, and understanding those experiences, and working collaboratively with community groups and individuals to oppose racism whenever we see it. And that's really significant. But don't neglect that central to this is our skill as early years educators and practitioners to give every child the best start in life, to make sure that children of different backgrounds don't fail in our system because we don't provide them with the start in their early years education they need, or the education they need that they need later on.
Thank you so much, Julian. As you can imagine, we had a very large number of questions on observations, tracking, how much evidence is required, and I really believe you've already covered those in your talks today. So we're going to crack on and come up with another couple of other questions. You've also quite generously agreed to have another Q&A session specifically about reception. So I'm not going to ask any of those questions that we have here about reception, with the exception of this one, which is about baseline. We're very aware that teachers and schools who are early adopters at the moment have welcomed their children in, and they're thinking, how am I going to baseline these children in my reception class? I'm not talking about the DFE baseline. So previously, schools may have chosen the 30-50 age band as secure, as the ones they wanted all those children to be at the beginning of reception. Can you give some advice for those reception teachers now, with the new Development Matters documents? How are they going to baseline those children in the next 2 or 3 weeks?
So I think I'm going to answer that question by first of all taking a bit of a step back and saying that in conversations around children's levels of development when they start reception, when there are discussions going on about things like, are they emerging 30 to 50? Are they secure 30 to 50? Are they exceeding 30 to 50? I think those are really unhelpful ways of thinking about children, because
Absolutely.
Who's arbitrating what the difference is between emerging and secure? 30 to 50, that's 20 months. That's a really kind of wide range, if you like, to then be thinking about as well. I don't think it's helpful. I think it succeeds, as Gill and Wendy were saying, in kind of creating some data to put on a spreadsheet, but it doesn't succeed in the human sphere of actually doing the best for the children that we come across. So I would suggest to reception teachers who are early adopters, think about a handful of things that are really important to a child's first days in reception, which I would suggest are their confidence, how well they manage the transition away from parent and into school, their communication. Are they understanding well? Are they communicating their ideas and their needs, or are they having difficulties in that area? Their physical development, are they moving around with ease? Are they interested in the physical challenges outdoors and indoors, or are they struggling with them? Are they managing self-care, or are they needing a lot of extra help? Those are the things that would really matter to me as a reception teacher, settling in and getting to know 30 new children. Again, going back to what Gill and Wendy said, I would want to be spending time getting to know those children and playing with them, doing things with them. And I wouldn't want some enormous tick list to complete about their learning and development across all the areas of the early years curriculum. Will that give you the sort of information that will show progress? You betcha it will, because that information about, for example, children's communication in the first few weeks in reception, that's going to give you a great starting point where we're going to really expect to see this child flourishing and communicating more and understanding more, talking in longer sentences, having longer conversations with people. Or if that isn't happening, we're going to be urgently finding out what extra help this child needs. Same with their physical development, same with their confidence. So it's giving you a useful but straightforward measure which allows you to show progress and doesn't tie people down unnecessarily in the early days, where really what they need to be doing is giving that extra bit of love and care and support to that little child who's coming to school for the first time.
And I would like to absolutely echo what you've said there, Julian, because certainly inspectors won't be going to schools asking how many months progress children have made, which group of children were at 30 to 50 months, which group of children were at 40 to 60 months, etc., etc. Inspectors are simply not interested in that. What inspectors will be interested in is, what do you expect children to learn while they are in reception? What is the reception curriculum in terms of language development, in terms of literacy, in terms of mathematics, in terms of physical development, in terms of knowledge and understanding of the world? And how does that prepare children for the national curriculum once they start in year 1? So it's that curriculum knowledge that we would expect school teachers and practitioners to have, and then their understanding of where children are on that curriculum journey when they start with them. So for a child that is really shy and doesn't want to talk and feels very insecure, and you can see them clinging to the edge of a playground or the room, for those children, getting them to a point where you can actually work out what they can do and can't do will be your first and vital task. It is about getting children confident enough to be able to share what they can do and engage in a relationship with you as a teacher or as a practitioner. Big steps.
Yeah. And if it's okay, just to kind of add another thought there that Gill just prompted me to remember, it's that I think we all know of the game that's played, which is that the majority of children are below the expected level of development when they start reception. And that's the data that we're sort of under pressure to create when we're in a data-driven sector, so that we can show how effective our provision is. But of course, it can't be the case that in every single school, every neighbourhood around the country, all these children are below the expected levels of development. And it just quickly became a form of game playing. It was much more important, I think, to establish quite quickly, with a light touch, which children need a lot of extra support and nurture to have a successful experience of reception, and quickly give them, and if necessary their families, the early help that they need. To take a sensible look at how ready the children are to engage with the sort of curriculum you've set out for the reception year. And if the curriculum is out of line with the children that are coming through your door, then any sensible practitioner is going to revise it and make sure that the children are getting the types of experiences they need today, not to fill in a spreadsheet at the end of the month to present to somebody else. So a lot of this comes out of being responsible, I would say, as in our approach to children and families. And it comes out, it's important to emphasize the professional judgment and skill that we have in our practitioners and teachers across the country. We don't need to second guess that with rows and rows and rows of data about number of months of progress, which is frankly dodgy data.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move to our final question, which is a much broader one. It's around the learning environment. And what would you expect to see in terms of the environment and learning provision, including a vocabulary-rich environment? Could you perhaps, each of you, talk about a really wonderful setting you've seen that could be aspirational for our listeners and viewers to end with today?
I think that's a really, really interesting question, because it depends what you mean by environment. So if we're thinking about environment as the physical space and the equipment that's provided, I think we've gone down a road of thinking that is what learning is about. Whereas actually, if we're thinking of the environment in terms of the ethos and the culture that the leaders of that setting set, the relationship building, the respectful nature of engagement with children, the encouragement, the vigilance, I would say, of when they can see that a child is going towards danger and they can prevent that, and also where they can encourage children to take risks that are within their, that are manageable, like your bike example, Julian. That's all environment in a different sense of that word. And so I think it's much easier to articulate what an outstanding environment is in terms of those relationships and culture of the setting than it is to say, well, you need lots of wooden toys and play equipment, because actually that's unaffordable for lots of places, and I'm thinking now of my experience of being in different countries and seeing children being wildly successful in their early years without any of the things that we would consider in our country as mandatory. And what that makes me consider is actually it isn't the things that make the difference, but it's the interactions and the way that you develop children through your learning culture, because not every nursery looks like Sheringham. And I know that actually in Sheringham, it's what you've put in place has been really thought through, but sitting underneath every decision that you've made about what equipment is there, sitting underneath that is an ethos and values and culture that is driven by a real moral purpose that makes the key difference. So we're in danger of thinking the wallpaper is what counts, and it isn't.
And I think that takes it right back to that whole thing around it being the curriculum, and actually, it's about knowing what it is that you want your children to learn and what you want your children to know to succeed, and then building your pedagogy around that, your teaching, your environment around that, rather than thinking about what an outstanding environment looks like.
And I guess perhaps where I can add something here is about the rider there, the including a vocabulary-rich environment. So we've been leading as a research school a project for the Education Endowment Foundation around children's early communication, and we've been working with PVI settings, school nurseries and childminders on this project. And I think there's a few really important things we've learned. First of all, that if you use, as we chose to use, a structured observational tool to look at the quality of communication in settings. So we used a tool called ITAS-3, which is an environmental rating scale. We all learned a lot about the quality of our provision seen through that structured tool, that there were children who were not talking much and were not really part of those conversations and communication-rich environments in the way that we'd like them to be. So in other words, perhaps we thought a lot about the overall pedagogy and approach, but we hadn't necessarily seen it through the eyes of all the children. All of the children getting this all of the time was a very tricky question for a lot of us to answer and to think about how we'd improve. I think the second thing we learned was that, of the big headlines, was that it's so much of this is about conversation with children. So sometimes you hear vocabulary-rich environment and you're imagining lists of words and staff kind of saying these words to children so that they hear the vocabulary. Well, yeah, children do need to hear the vocabulary, but they need to hear it in the context of a conversation that they're part of for the majority of their learning and development. So you have to really listen to children and be interested in them and be there with them so that you are having conversations that you can then bring in that rich vocabulary too, so that it's very natural for the children, and that's really powerful. And I think the other thing that is so often an issue for us in terms of vocabulary and communication is the danger of just talking far too much and not letting the children have enough time and this especially was true for our young bilingual learners in Newham, is that we have to make sure we give them enough time to process and to think what they want to say, and then build on that. And I think a lot of early years practitioners are fantastically good at holding conversations with children, but we get knocked off track because we think someone is observing us and wants to see us talking a lot, or wants to see us introducing a lot of vocabulary. But when we're more relaxed, we're having a conversation, but we're then dropping in some words that maybe the child isn't so familiar with, and we're extending that conversation so that they're over more terms. So I would want to see lots of children having conversations both with each other and with the practitioners as crucial.
Thank you so much, all three of you. I think that's been such an informative session. I can't wait to release this. I know we have thousands of people who are looking forward to hearing your answers of our many dozens of questions that we had sent to us. I think it's really, really going to help their practice.